Behind the velvet curtains of royal chambers and the glitter of golden banquets, there lurked a terror that no sword or crown could defeat. In the medieval age, the nobles believed to be chosen by God fell victim to mysterious plagues that history dared not record. Among them was the fabled Silver Death, a sickness that began as trembling hands and ended with a ghostly shimmer on the skin, as though death itself painted its victims in metallic silver. Physicians whispered theories of poisoned wines, cursed jewels, or dark magic cast by rival houses. Yet none survived long enough to prove it. Servants who witnessed the deaths were silenced, either by fear or royal decree. The disease struck only among the wealthy. Never the peasants, a mystery that baffled even the most learned scholars. Some claimed it was divine punishment for arrogance. Others believed it was a hidden plague spread through imported silks and spices from the East. Entire bloodlines were erased in a single season, yet the chronicles remained blank. The court poets wrote of peaceful departures, while graveyards overflowed in silence. Centuries later, when the sealed tombs of nobles were opened, traces of an unknown toxin were found on their bones, evidence that the Silver Death had been real and that the medieval elite had died not in glory but in secrecy and fear. King Armand of Valois was the very image of divine power, a ruler draped in silk and gold. But when his reign was cut short in 1349, the royal scribes claimed it was a chill of the heart. In truth, it was something far more sinister. A hidden illness had crept through the palace corridors, killing his queen, 2 sons, and half the court in less than a month. The survivors sealed the castle, burning the linens and destroying every record of what truly happened. Royal physicians were bound by oath and terror, their tongues cut or their heads taken if they dared speak of the crimson fever. Only fragments of their writings survive, letters smuggled to a monastery describing bleeding eyes, blackened tongues, and victims who screamed of angels with burning wings. The church refused to acknowledge it, claiming it was blasphemy to believe God's chosen could suffer plague. For generations, the Valois family line was whispered to be cursed. Chroniclers avoided the topic, fearing royal wrath. But centuries later, hidden diaries revealed the truth. The plague was not divine punishment, but the result of poisoned wells near the castle, tainted by war. The king's death was covered up to preserve the illusion of holiness. In the end, the royal family's greatest disease was not the fever, it was pride. They called it the Whispering Death. It crept through the halls of nobility like smoke, silent, invisible, unstoppable. The first sign was a tremor in the fingers, then sudden stillness. By dawn, the victims were cold, their veins dark, and their eyes open, staring at nothing. Priests refused to touch the bodies, fearing it was the work of demons. Physicians sealed their doors, claiming ignorance. In the archives of a forgotten monastery, a monk's confession speaks of a strange pattern. Every noble struck down by the disease had recently received gifts from the East, perfumed oils, silk robes, and cosmetics laced with mercury. The same luxury that defined their status became their killer. The plague was not spread by air, but by vanity. To protect their image, courts ordered all records destroyed. Families buried their dead in secret, sometimes burning entire estates to erase the trace of infection. The lower classes never knew the truth. They believed the nobles had been taken by divine judgment.
Yet, the sickness persisted for decades, always among the wealthy, never the poor.
The Whispering Death became legend, a punishment for those who believed their wealth made them immortal. In the end, the silence of the nobility became their gravestone in the 5th-10th century. Across Europe, Is Grandis the Coat's death had a different name. It was not called plague, it was called noble fatigue, golden fever, blood rot. Behind those polished titles was a truth too scandalous to reveal. Kings and queens were dying like commoners. When the court of Castile lost 3 heirs in a single winter, the people were told it was a family tragedy, but servants whispered of a disease that made the blood boil beneath the skin. Priests were ordered to bless the corpses in secret. The royal physicians conducted their autopsies at night, burning their tools afterward to hide the evidence. In Burgundy, The same sickness spread after a royal banquet. Guests collapsed at the tables, their lips stained black from poisoned wine, but the poison came, not from a rival, but from the chalices themselves. Silver goblets, polished with mercury, had leached toxins into the drink. To admit this would ruin the crown's prestige, so the truth was buried with the dead. For centuries, official histories remained clean, but the private letters of nobles tell another story. Of fear, secrecy, and guilt. The royal plagues were not divine. They were man-made horrors, born from ignorance and greed. Behind every jeweled crown lay the shadow of a disease, too shameful to name. The winter of 1372 brought joy to Thornhill Castle.
The king's niece was to be married in a grand feast attended by hundreds of nobles.
The halls gleamed with gold, the air thick with perfume and laughter. But by midnight, that laughter turned to screams. Guests began collapsing one by one, their faces pale and blistered, their throats closing as if invisible hands were strangling them. The king ordered the gates sealed, believing the sickness was punishment for sin. 4 weeks, the castle echoed with prayers, cries, and silence. When spring came, and the doors were finally opened, soldiers found a frozen scene. Nobles seated at the feast table, their food untouched, their faces frozen in terror. Not a single living soul remained. The tragedy was erased from royal history, rewritten as a fire accident. But villagers nearby told their children tales of the cursed feast, where spirits of prideful nobles feasted with death itself. Centuries later, archaeologists uncovered bones from the cytraces of a rare fungus known to release deadly toxins in enclosed spaces. It wasn't magic. It was science the medieval world couldn't yet understand. But for the nobles who believed themselves untouchable, Thornhill's silent halls became their eternal tomb, a reminder that even power cannot silence death. In the heart of 14th century Venice, the Doge's palace gleamed with marble and song. But beneath the chandeliers, death waited. It began with a noblewoman named Contessa Fiora, who awoke one morning with black spots along her spine. Within days, her flesh turned gray and brittle. Soon, every guest who had danced beside her at the masquerade began to fall ill. The Senate called it the quiet sickness. They forbade its mention in public, fearing panic and loss of trade. Ships were ordered to sail under false flags, bodies were buried at sea, and physicians were sworn to silence under penalty of death. Behind the curtains of politics, an invisible enemy was devouring the ruling class. Years later, a hidden journal revealed the truth the plague had been carried through exotic perfumes imported from the East. Nobles drenched themselves in the scent of luxury, unaware it carried deadly spores. The very fragrance that marked their status became the perfume of death. For centuries, the quiet sickness remained erased from history. But the letters of servants told all that beauty, wealth, and pride had poisoned the blood of Venice's most powerful. In medieval England, kings feared not armies, but shame. When King Edmund's court fell ill in 1421, he silenced every whisper. His knights died in days, their skin cracked and bleeding gold-tinged pus. The royal alchemists called it the gilded rot. Priests insisted it was divine wrath. The truth, a mysterious contagion born from the king's own vanity. Edmund had demanded his armor be lined with powdered metals for divine ladiance. The constant contact poisoned his body, and every servant who handled his garments soon shared his fate. As the infection spread, the king blamed witches, executing hundreds. But the deaths continued until Edmund himself collapsed during Mass, his crown slipping from his trembling head. The chroniclers dared not record the truth. His death was declared holy ascension. But in secret manuscripts, one monk wrote, "The king shone with false gold, and God took back his light." Centuries later, traces of mercury and gold dust were found in his tomb. The gilded rot was no curse, just the cost of royal arrogance masquerading as divine glory. Few records survive from the courts of Hungary in the 1300s, and that is no accident. A hidden epidemic wiped out nearly half the royal household, and the survivors destroyed every trace of it. The disease began with faint humming in the ears, then blindness, then madness. Victims screamed of singing shadows before dying in violent spasms. The court physicians blamed music, forbidding all instruments inside the palace. But servants told another story, a strange mold growing in the royal wine cellars, glowing faintly in the dark. It tainted the wine that only nobles drank, sparing the servants who tasted only bread and water.
When the king's son died, the royal archivists were ordered to burn every page mentioning the sickness.
The monastery that kept records of the event was later accidentally burned to ash. Historians thought it Methentel. The ruins of that cellar were found in 1892, still coated in a fungus that produced lethal neurotoxins. The royal family's madness wasn't a curse. It was science centuries too early to understand. The singing plague became a whisper in folklore, a song the dead still hum beneath the earth. Every dynasty believes its blood is sacred, but in the medieval world, that blood was often its undoing. In the court of Aragon, generations of nobles suffered from a mysterious disease that caused madness, convulsions, and eventual suffocation. They called it the blood silence. It appeared in no records, yet it destroyed an entire lineage over 2 centuries. At first, physicians suspected witchcraft. Later, some whispered it was a family curse. But private journals discovered in the 1800s tell a different truth. Sickness wasn't supernatural, but genetic. Centuries of intermarriage among royals had concentrated a rare blood disorder that slowly poisoned their bodies from within. To admit such weakness was unthinkable. So every generation invented new lies. A fall from horse, fever from bad air, divine punishment. Their coffins, however, told the truth: bones, brittle as glass, skulls deformed from birth defects. The blood silence was hidden by shame, not mystery. The kings who called themselves chosen by God were destroyed by their own arrogance, proving that the deadliest plague was sometimes the one born of pride, not pestilence. Behind every royal feast, there were secrets served alongside the wine. In the court of Bavaria, chefs prepared delicacies using powdered gemstones, believing they brought strength and beauty. But as the years passed, nobles began to fall ill, vomiting blood, suffering paralysis, and rotting alive from within. The court physicians couldn't explain it. The church called it a curse. One young alchemist, Lucas von Lotto, risked execution by examining the remains. He discovered that crushed gems like emerald and sapphire contained arsenic and copper, deadly poisons, slowly killing those who consumed them daily. He tried to warn the duke, but the order came too late. Within a year, most of the court was dead, and Lucas was found drowned in the moat. The tragedy was erased from history. Official records described a fire in the kitchen, but letters from servants tell otherwise. The nobles were poisoned by their own vanity. They ate beauty and found death. Today, the ruins of that Bavarian palace still show signs of sealed tunnels and charred vaults, where the truth was buried forever. The throne was not just a seat of power, it was a target for death itself. In the 13th century, across Europe, kings began dying mysteriously, one after another. They called it the throne's curse. But this was no superstition, it was a pattern. The kings of Scotland, Bohemia, and Navarre all died within weeks of strange fevers, hallucinations, and bleeding from their eyes. Behind these deaths lay a hidden truth. Their thrones, carved from rare African wood and gilded with gold, were polished daily with oils mixed by alchemists. Those oils contained lead and mercury. Over years, the poison seeped into the skin of the rulers who sat upon them daily.
Royal healers dared not suggest such blasphemy that the symbol of divine rule itself was killing the kings.
So they called it God's wrath, or witchcraft, or the weight of sin. But the deaths kept coming, and soon the throne rooms grew cold and silent. Generations later, scientists testing the relics of those thrones found traces of deadly metals embedded deep in the wood. The truth was horrifying. The kings were poisoned not by enemies, but by their own symbols of power. The throne that crowned them in glory also crowned them in death in the glittering courts of Byzantium. Royal blood was believed to be. Yet one winter, a plague began that made even the gods seem cruel. The emperor's children fell ill, first high fevers, blistered lips, and a strange glow in their veins. Within weeks, every heir was dead, and the empress soon followed. The empire's doctors blamed foreign assassins, but the truth was hidden deeper than any dagger. An alchemist from the East had recently gifted the emperor a miracle elixir said to grant eternal youth. It was brewed with powdered gold, arsenic, and honey. The court drank it daily, believing it to be divine medicine. Instead, it slowly destroyed their blood. When the emperor himself began coughing blood, the potion was quietly removed, and its creator executed without trial. To save face, the deaths were rewritten as divine selection. The empire could not admit that greed for immortality had poisoned its own line. For centuries, historians believed it was plague or pox, but when the tombs were opened, traces of heavy metal poisoning were found in every royal skull. The elixir meant to preserve life had erased it completely. The unseen death of royal blood was a lesson the empire never lived to learn. Few places were more cursed than the Palace of Ruang. Behind its jeweled doors, nobles lived in luxury, but the air itself was deadly. In 1384, a strange illness began spreading through the upper chambers. Servants were forbidden to speak of it. Those who fell ill first complained of sweet-smelling air that made their heads spin. Within days, their lungs filled with black liquid. Physicians declared it an unholy sickness, performing prayers instead of treatment. But one young herbalist discovered the truth. The palace walls were painted with a rare green pigment made from arsenic and copper.
When heated by candles, it released toxic vapors that slowly poisoned everyone inside.
The king's council executed the herbalist to silence her discovery. Yet, months later, the entire court was dead. Their final banquet had been held in that same hall, beneath those same painted walls. The official record claimed a fever of unknown origin, but the truth was buried under layers of poisoned beauty. For centuries, people spoke of ghostly figures coughing in the empty halls of Ruang, victims of their own luxury, suffocating on air that glittered with death. Some plagues destroyed lives. Others destroyed legacies. In the royal houses of Europe, unseen illnesses often decided who ruled and who vanished from history. Between 1350 and 1450, entire dynasties disappeared not from war, but from the soft plague, a strange wasting sickness that spared no crown. The disease was never spoken of publicly.
It began with trembling hands, loss of memory, and slow decay of the mind.
Victims lived for years, forgetting names, laws, even their own children. Councils of nobles quietly replaced them, forging documents to pretend the monarchs still ruled. Historians later discovered the truth. The soft plague was mercury poisoning from cosmetic powders used by royal women and men alike. The paste, used to whiten their faces, slowly invaded their nerves and brains. Some of Europe's greatest kings died drooling and delirious, hidden away while their advisors ruled in their name. The plague shaped politics, wars, and borders wild the world never knew. The soft plague did not sweep across villages. It spread through mirrors, combs, and vanity. Its victims never knew they were dying until their crowns slipped from trembling hands. The royal family of Lorraine was known for their beauty, their feasts, and their mysterious deaths. Every winter, someone new in the bloodline would shivered, delirious, their skin covered in dark blotches. The court called it the winter curse. The disease seemed selective. It spared servants, but took only nobles. Rumor spread that the family had angered God, but the truth was found centuries later in the castle's kitchen. The water pipes were lined with lead. For generations, the nobles drank only from the ornate silver fountains that carried poisoned water, while servants drank from wells outside. Slowly, the family was destroyed by their own luxury. Their symptoms were recorded as holy sickness, and priests turned each death into a sermon about sin. By the final generation, only one Araminda, young duchess who fled the castle and married a commoner. Her children survived, never knowing the truth. Their dynasty had fallen not by sword or betrayal, but by the silent killer flowing through their golden cups. In 14th century Florence, beneath frescoed ceilings and perfumed corridors, nobles began to waste away. They called it the Velvet Plague, a strange illness that struck only those who wore imported velvets and silks. The disease began with rashes on the neck, then slow decay of the flesh beneath. The poor remained untouched. Merchants were accused of witchcraft, and dozens were executed. But one physician, Master Alonso Ifiezor, secretly dissected the corpses of the afflicted and found threads of fungus embedded in their wounds. The humidity of Italian palaces had bred a deadly mold within the expensive fabrics themselves. When Alonso revealed his findings, the Medici family ordered his silence. Their wealth and prestige depended on the trade of these exotic cloths. The Velvet Plague was buried, both the evidence and the victims, but the secret spread through whispers. And for years, nobles lived in fear of their own wardrobes. Centuries later, when old vaults were opened, the same mold still lingered in the decayed garments, proof that beauty had become disease. The crowned elite were destroyed, not by rebellion or war, but by the luxury they refused to surrender. In the icy halls of Sweden's royal court, a sickness spread that no one dared to speak of. It began with strange laughter fits of hysteria that turned to convulsions. Those afflicted danced uncontrollably until their bodies gave out. The priests said they were possessed. The king said nothing at all. The disease was soon named the Laughing Death. It took servants, then courtiers, and finally the queen herself. Physicians experimented with bloodletting and holy relics, but nothing stopped it. At last, a desperate doctor traced the illness to the royal kitchen, where mold had overtaken the grain used in daily bread. The infected rye contained toxins that caused madness, hallucinations, and death. To reveal such a truth would destroy the image of divine monarcha, so the doctor disappeared, his records burned. The story became myth, retold as a tale of cursed laughter haunting the palace. Centuries later, when the royal archives were examined, notes written in invisible ink confirmed the doctor's discovery. The plague was real, the laughter unnatural. In the end, it wasn't demons that danced through the halls, it was poison born from hunger and pride. Every palace had secrets, but none darker than those of the French court under King Henry II. In the summer of 1558, his nobles began dying one by one. The symptoms were bizarre: swollen tongues, black lips, and bleeding eyes. The court blamed witches. The king's astrologer, Nostradamus, was summoned, but even he refused to name the sickness. For years, the truth remained hidden. Then, centuries later, letters written by the royal physician were found, describing an invisible poison carried by the court's cosmetics. The nobles, both men and women, painted their faces with vanithan white, a powder made from lead. Every brushstroke drew them closer to death. Those who refused to stop using it were mocked as unrefined. By the time the king himself fell ill, it was too late. The royal family's portraits, painted with the same toxic pigment, would become their eternal memorial. They smiled in beauty, even as poison seeped through their veins. The hidden epidemic of France was never recorded in official chronicles, but the evidence remains lead-laced makeup jars buried beside skeletons whose bones still glitter faintly with death. The House of Lancaster was proud, powerful, and doomed. In the early 1400s, a strange illness began haunting their halls. The nobles grew pale, their teeth blackened, and their minds slipped into madness. They accused each other of treason, burned servants alive, and saw ghosts in mirrors. Historians once believed it was stress from endless wars, but modern researchers discovered the truth. Their goblets and utensils were made of pewter alloy, mixed with lead. 4 years, every meal poisoned them slowly. The symptoms: delirium, memory loss, and decay were mistaken for curses. The king ordered all mirrors removed, believing reflections carried evil. His final act was to order his own castle burned, shouting that the devil lives in the walls. When his remains were examined, centuries later, his bones contained levels of lead 10 times higher than normal. The curse of Lancaster wasn't magic, it was chemistry. The royal family had eaten, drunk, and lived their way into madness. In Portugal's royal court, stories of plague were forbidden by decree. The king believed that speaking of death, invited it, but death came anyway, wrapped in silence. In 1477, a mysterious fever swept the palace. Victims' skin glowed faintly in candlelight, and their breath carried a metallic scent. Entire families died overnight. The court called it the Silver Fever, and ordered every servant who witnessed it executed. The royal historian's records for that year were wiped clean, pages torn, ink burned. But a hidden document, smuggled by a monk, tells what really happened. The royal mint, located beneath the palace, had been producing coins using mercury. The vapors seeped through the stone floors, poisoning the nobles above. When the truth was discovered, it was already too late. The palace was sealed for a century, its story erased from Portugal's history books, yet the walls still whisper the truth. That silence does not hide, death it feeds it. The Silver Fever proved that the more royals tried to conceal their plagues, the more their secrets consumed them. In the glittering heart of the Holy Roman Empire, the royal court was known for its opulent golden banquets, perfumed chambers, and endless indulgence. But beneath the splendor, death moved unseen. The emperor's court suffered a mysterious illness every summer. Nobles began with headaches, then convulsions, and finally, madness. The affliction was called the summer shadow. Doctors bled patients, priests prayed, and astrologers blamed the alignment of Mars. Yet no one dared mention the truth that the palace fountains flowed with tainted water. The marble basins had been carved from limestone soaked in arsenic from nearby mines. The richer the court, the deadlier the drink. When the emperor's daughter died in agony, her body exuding a faint metallic scent, the truth was uncovered by a low-born physician. He was executed before his findings spread. The official record claimed heatstroke. But centuries later, when the palace wells were tested, the same poison remained. The summer shadow was not divine punishment, it was royal negligence. And the greatest empire in Europe had poisoned itself from within. At Dunhaven Castle, silence ruled. In 1395, a plague broke out so horrifying that even the priests refused to record its name. Servants who tried to flee were executed on the spot. The illness struck only those who dined at the king's table, leaving the lower ranks untouched. Victims suffered burning tongues, crimson boils, and blindness before death. The royal council spread rumors of sorcery, blaming a servant girl who vanished after the first death. But hidden in the castle's cellar, a ledger revealed the truth. The wine that filled the nobles' goblets was imported in barrels lined with lead to enhance flavor. Each sip was slow poison. To protect the crown's image, all documents were destroyed, the castle sealed, and the dead buried without names. Centuries later, explorers found traces of lead dust thick around the wine cellar walls. The silence of Dunhaven had not been superstition, it was shame. The nobles who silenced their servants had, unknowingly, silenced themselves in Paris. During the late 14th century, the salons of the aristocracy were filled with laughter, poetry, and death. A strange illness began to sweep through the city's illy coughing fits that turned into suffocation. Servants called it the Whispering Plague because its victims gasped as if whispering their final words. Physicians blamed foul air, burning herbs in every room. But the true cause came from the very thing nobles prized most: perfume. The luxurious oils and floral scents imported from Arabia were preserved using toxic compounds derived from mercury and lead. Each breath of sweetness carried a dose of poison. The church forbade mention of it, calling perfumes temptations of vanity. Yet the deaths continued. The aristocracy's obsession with beauty became their doom. Even after centuries, archaeologists found traces of these poisons in ornate perfume bottles buried with noble women. The quiet epidemics proved that elegance itself had turned lethal, a reminder that even the sweetest scents can mask decay. Across the royal courts of Europe, a silent war was fought not with armies, but with illness. From England to Bohemia, rulers fell victim to diseases that no one could name. Chroniclers whispered of the pale sleep, a sickness that began with fatigue and ended with the body turning chalk white. In truth, it was the cost of greed. Alchemists across the continent experimented with elixirs of eternal life, blending mercury, sulfur, and crushed pearls. Kings and queens drank them daily, believing they had found immortality. Instead, they poisoned their blood. Centuries later, forensic analysis of royal remains revealed mercury levels hundreds of times above normal. The victims were not cursed, they were victims of their own ambition. The pale sleep was never recorded as plagued. It was called peaceful passing. But behind that peace lay centuries of silent suffering. In their pursuit to live forever, the kings of Europe instead condemned their bloodlines to extinction. In the 13th century, while peasants fought famine and plague, the upper class faced a quieter terror, one they never named. It began in the courts of Burgundy, spreading through noble households like a ghost. The disease caused trembling, pale skin, and sudden death. Physicians called it the gentle sickness because victims seemed to fade away in peace. No one noticed that it spread only through feasts and banquets. The culprit was their golden tableware goblets, forks, and plates coated in gilding that leached lead into their food.
The more lavish the feast, the faster death came.
When a duke's entire family perished after a single banquet, the truth nearly surfaced. But the church declared it a divine test and burned the physician who exposed it. The gentle sickness was erased from chronicles, its victims remembered as saints. Centuries later, scientists confirmed the truth through skeletal remainstresses of lead in royal bones. Silent evidence of vanity's price. The nobles believed themselves above plague. Yet, in their palaces, beneath gold and silk, they were the most infected of all. In the frozen courts of Scandinavia, the nobility believed they were untouchable, blessed by gods older than Christ himself. Yet one by one, their rulers began to die. Their skin blistered, their tongues turned black, and their breath carried the stench of rot. Chroniclers called it the frost fever, but it was no fever, it was poison. Royal healers had been experimenting with new elixirs of vitality, brewed from rare herbs and minerals imported from the East. What they didn't know was that the mineral powder, highly prized for its shimmering blue color, contained cobalt and arsenic. The nobles who drank it daily were poisoning themselves slowly, their bodies decaying from within, while their servants remained unharmed. When the king's son died convulsing on his throne, the court blamed witchcraft. Dozens of women were executed, yet the deaths continued. In secret, the royal apothecary recorded the symptoms in a hidden book, later found centuries after. The frost fever wasn't a curse, it was luxury killing its masters. Venice, the jewel of the sea, was once a paradise for the wealthy. Its nobles bathed in perfumes, jewels, and the sweet scent of power. But beneath that beauty, a secret illness thrived. It began with dizziness, then bleeding gums, and finally, madness. Historians now call it the Crimson Curse. The cause? Mercury-laced cosmetics. Venetian nobles used a bright red face paint called vermilion to appear youthful during court events. The more they painted, the sicker they became. But vanity ruled stronger than, since no one dared appear unadorned. Even as their teeth fell out and their minds fractured, they smiled beneath painted masks. The church called it God's punishment for vanity, and the Senate buried the truth to protect Venice's reputation as Europe's paradise. Yet when crypts were opened centuries later, traces of mercury were found in the bones of the dead nobles. The Crimson Curse wasn't just a plague, it was beauty turned fatal. In 1428, a grand feast was held at Ironhall Castle to celebrate the king's victory in battle. Hundreds of nobles gathered, laughing and drinking into the night. By morning, over half were dead. The survivors spoke of stomach pain, hallucinations, and paralysis. The court sealed the castle immediately. Officially, it was a fever from spoiled wine. But when the royal steward's journal was discovered, centuries later, the horrifying truth emerged: the castle's new iron cookware had been forged using contaminated or mixed with lead. The feast itself had become a death sentence. The king's advisors suppressed the scandal to protect the crown's honor. Survivors were sworn to secrecy, and all records of the event were erased. Yet the story lived on in whispers, a cursed banquet where laughter turned to screams.
And the walls still echoed with the sound of choking guests.
Ironhall Castle stands in ruins today, a tomb of gluttony and ignorance. In the courts of France, beauty was power. Courtesans ruled through charm, grace, and flawless faces until one by one, they began to waste away. Their hair fell out, their skin burned, and madness followed. The courtiers whispered of a beauty curse, but the truth was more sinister. The cosmetics they used, face powders imported from Spain, were made with white lead and vinegar, giving them the ghostly glow of porcelain. Over time, the poison seeped into their blood. The most beautiful women of the kingdom were dying by their own reflection. The queen's favorite, Lady Amélie de Roche, left behind a final letter. "We are killed by what keeps us adored." The king ordered her room sealed, and all her mirrors destroyed. To this day, her sealed chamber in Chateau de Roche remains untouched. Some say her reflection still lingers on the cracked mirror left behind, reminder that in the medieval world, beauty itself could be a plague. As the Middle Ages drew to an end, Europe faced one last hidden horror, the plague no one dared name. It struck only noble families, beginning with dark blotches around the eyes, then blindness, then death. They called it the Black Veil. Unlike the common plagues, it didn't spread by air, or touch it was hereditary. Generations of nobles had intermarried, keeping bloodlines pure for power and status. But the lack of genetic diversity had created fatal mutations. The royal bloodlines were literally rotting from within. Records show entire dynasties collapsing within a single decade. Doctors claimed divine wrath. Priests blamed sin. In truth, it was nature's quiet revenge. When one French duchess gave birth to a child already marked by the Black Veil, she ordered the entire lineage's history to be erased. The disease died with them forgotten, buried beneath centuries of pride. But to this day, historians studying royal tombs find evidence of the same mutatione lingering shadow of humanity's arrogance. When kings thought themselves gods and learned that even divine blood can decay,